Hey guys, this is Mitch with Finepoint CGI, and today we're going to talk about how to do photo scanning and build assets for your game. So we're going to go through the process of talking about the different ways to do photo scanning. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of a dedicated camera or using your phone. We're going to talk about different lighting conditions and when it's appropriate and when it's not. We're also going to talk about how to approach doing photo scanning. And finally, we're actually going to do photo scanning. We're going to create an asset using Meshroom. We're going to retopo that asset inside of Blender. We're going to use Krita to create our roughness and metallic maps. And then finally, we're going to import it into our game engine, which in this case is Godot, although you could use whichever game engine you prefer. So that's what I have in store for you guys today. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first thing we have to talk about is what is photo scanning. So photo scanning, also called photogrammetry, is the process that you take photos and you make 3D objects. So you do this by taking a bunch of different pictures and a bunch of different angles to actually pull back that information and calculate out a 3D object. Now, the type of weather that you're looking for is something like cloudy, and you really want to have zero shadows if you can. You just want to have the ambient occlusion or a non-shadowed environment during your photography session. Now, you could do this in a lot of ways. You can take lights and things like that to kind of drown out the shadows, or you can actually just take pictures on a cloudy day and that will work as well. The photos do matter. So most assets, in my experience, take 30 to 50 photos. However, some have taken me up to 100 photos. So that's something to keep in mind, is that you need to make sure that you get sufficient amount of photos with a lot of overlap. So don't be afraid of taking more photos than necessary. All it does is take more processing time than if you have less photos, but you might get a better result. Now, the question that some people have asked me is, what kind of tools do I use? So I have a Canon M100 camera and I have a smartphone, and both of them take decent enough photos for it to be worth it. So you don't need to buy a dedicated camera. You can just use a smartphone for what you're looking for. You also could get a ring light if you really want even lighting on your objects, but generally speaking, it's not completely necessary to get decent results. Now that I've given you kind of a primer on what you need to do, go out, take a few photos on a cloudy day and come back to this tutorial and we'll go through and process it. Or if you don't have the time, go ahead and go down into the link in the description below and you can pull down the photos and the assets used in this tutorial, and that'll get you a good prime starting point. So anyway, let's go ahead and start processing our data. All right, now that we're at my desktop, let's go ahead and plug in our camera and turn it on. Now, if you're using your phone, you could just plug in your phone and that's fine as well. We'll plug that in and turn it on, and you'll see that's going to pop up with my Canon EOS M100, which is the camera that I'm using. We're going to double click on SD. We're going to click on DCIM 103805, and we're going to grab these images here. I'm not going to grab all of them just because there are some images that I, don't really want to use. We'll grab all the ones that we can. And I'm going to go into my photogrammetry section, which I have under, I believe, E, photogrammetry, and tutorial dump. I'm going to drag these guys into here. I'm going to let that copy over. And it will take a little bit, so I'm going to be right back. Some of these files, especially if you do it in RAW format, which is generally how I do all of my photogrammetries with RAW, they're around 45 to 50 megabytes in size, whereas if you were to use something like JPEG, they're usually around 12 or so megabytes in size. So this is copying quite a bit of data, somewhere in the realm of probably a couple gigs. So it's going to be a minute. So I'll be right back. All right, now that we have the files copied over, let's go ahead and talk about how we're going to be going about this. I'm going to disconnect my camera here. And first thing you'll notice is we have a bunch of JPEG files here. We have a bunch of CR2 files. Now, the reason why I've done both is because I wanted to have a conversation about the advantages and disadvantages of a JPEG versus a CR2 file. Now, if you have a JPEG file, you can basically just take it and drop it directly into your photogrammetry processing software, which in this case is going to be Meshroom. But if you actually did it in a CR2 file, you're going to have to do a lot more processing. And the reason why is because CR2 gives us a lot more flexibility and a lot more work that we can actually do with this photo to make it actually into something. So to illustrate this, we're going to use a tool called Darktable. And Darktable is awesome. It is a tool that basically allows you to work with raw format files in an easy to use way. So if you come into the install right up here on the upper right hand corner, you pick your OS. In my case, I have Windows, but if you have Linux or if you have Mac, go ahead and pull one of these guys. I'm going to pull the Windows one down and I'm going to save that. I will double click on Darktable. You can see it says, hey, we already have one installed. You probably won't run into this, but we'll hit yes so it can reinstall it. So that way we have a new version of Darktable already set up. So we'll hit next, 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 install, and let that run through. Now, once it's finished, click finish. And then we're going to open up Windows. We're going to type Darktable, and you will see that Darktable will launch. Now, it might launch with a lot of my files already loaded. It depends on if the Darktable database got rewritten or not. It depends on if it actually removed the database, which it looks like it did. So we'll go ahead and add in some images. So we'll go out to where our dump is actually located. So it's right here. I'm going to hit Control A. Well, actually, I don't know if I want to do Control A. Let's change this from view to medium icons. And you can see we have a bunch of icons. So if I drop in these two files here, which is a CR2 and a JPEG. So if I zoom in real close, you can see that I have a CR2 and a JPEG of the same image. So I'm going to drag that guy in and we're going to take a look at him. So if we double click on our JPEG, here is our JPEG file. If I zoom in and I take a look at it, you can see that this is what it looks like. If we just kind of zoom in to right here, and then I go back to my other one, and then I go back to this one, you will notice something. A lot of processing has been done on the JPEG version. You'll notice by the waveform here and by the waveform here that it's done a lot of that work for us. You'll also notice that if we look at, for instance, like this area here, you can see how blurry this image is versus how sharp this image is. And the reason for that is because your camera will do a lot of the processing for you and a lot of the adjustments for you. Now, this can be great, but it can also be a gigantic problem. If you're trying to do something like color correcting, or you're trying to do something like, sharpening or blurring or things like that, doing that to a JPEG image generally produces worse results. Generally speaking, it doesn't have as much ability to be adjusted like a CR2 file does. But does that mean that you should shoot in CR2 or in RAW format? Or should you shoot in JPEG? And really, the choice is up to you. It really depends on if you get the quality that you're looking for out of your JPEG image versus out of your CR2 image. Generally speaking, I shoot in RAW, but as time has gone on, I've started to look at shooting more in JPEG just because of the amount of processing that I do of it is really not that big of a deal. Now, when it comes to processing, all I really do is I come in here, I tend to really up my sharpen quite a bit, something like this. So you can see it's really sharp. And the reason why I do that is because I want to make sure that I have a very strong sharpen on it, because it's going to get mixed down into a texture and you're going to lose all that sharpness anyway. It's just going to help with retaining some of that detail. So the first thing I always do is I throw my sharpness up really high. I come into here and I usually pull this guy up so that way my waveform is a nice balanced wave. I take a look at it. Sometimes I adjust this if I feel like it needs it, which it kind of does. So I'm going to pull this guy back just a little bit. And you can see what it looks like. So this is what it looks like. This is the JPEG. So did I lose any data? I lost a little bit here. You can see in this general area, if I go back to this guy, there's a little bit more color to it, but that's also because I've done my own retouch. You can see right here how my waveform is not the same as this waveform. And that's because my retouch is slightly different. If I pull this back a little bit, you'll see that it's probably much closer, perhaps with a little bit more sharpness. But really, the detail loss is basically minimal between the JPEG version and the RAW version. So generally speaking, it doesn't really matter. Just shoot in whichever one you prefer. Now, when it comes to color balance, I usually like to drop into my color correction node right here. And I generally like to just color correct it just slightly with a little bit more of whichever way I feel like makes it look a little bit better. In this case, I'm just going to give it, if I look at this waveform here, if I look at this little line here, you can see that there's just a little bit of extra blue at my tops. So I'm just going to pull this over until my blues and everything kind of match up. And that's how I know it's a decently color corrected image. So you can see if it's like this, you can see I have just a little bit of blue right here. I don't know if you guys can see that. I might zoom in for you, but there's a little bit of blue right here. And if I pull this forward, that blue kind of goes in line with the rest of my stuff. And that's basically what I'm looking for. And once I have that, I'm basically good. So what I do is I go back to light table. I'm going to get rid of my JPEG version of this. So I think that's this one. So that's my second one. So we'll remove that from dark table. Yes. And then we'll come into here. We'll go into my tutorial dump. I'm going to grab all my CR2 files minus the one that I color corrected. So we'll come in here, which, by the way, that color correction goes also for JPEG. I do the same thing for my JPEGs. So don't think that I don't do it for either. I actually do it for both just in case, because I want to make sure that my color correction is correct and that it works. So now I might need to pull this a little bit bigger to match up all my CR2. If I just do a search for .cr2, I can just grab all of these files and drag and drop them in. And it should hopefully import them all. It will take a minute, so I'm going to be right back and let that import. Now that it's got it all imported, basically, we can select this one guy, and you can see here's what it looks like. If we go to our next one, you can see what it looks like. So what we can do is we can go back to light table. We can click copy, select our first one, select our last one, and hit paste. And what it's going to do is it's going to run through and basically process all of these guys with the same exposure settings. Now you'll notice that there are a few that are a little on the funkier side. So for instance, this guy's a little bit out there. So if I double click on him, we will probably need to adjust this one manually. So we'll come in, pull this down. There we go. And that'll just clean that up. And then I will probably just copy this guy and paste it on these two just to help even out those the lighting on them. I'm going to grab these guys, do the same thing, paste. That's going to balance out those guys. Same thing with these guys. And I think that will do. There we are. And I'm going to select all of them, and then I need to export them. So I'll come over here to my export button, and I will click export. What that's going to do is it's going to export them out to my photo dump here, and you can see we have a dark table export. And it's going to export them out as PNG files. Now, you'll notice that it's going to take a long time to do it. So we have about 36 files, so I'm going to be right back. All right, once we have it all exported right here, we can actually start using our photogrammetry software. Now, the photogrammetry software I'm going to be using in this specific tutorial is Meshroom. Now, personally, I prefer Metashape, but Meshroom is free and it is open source, so you guys can use it for your projects. If we head over to Meshroom's website, link is in the description for this, by the way. This tool is awesome. It allows you to actually create realistic assets for your game from photos, which is really cool. So what we'll do is we'll come over to Meshroom and we will click download. Now, here's where some things come in. So if you have an Nvidia GPU, go ahead and download this Meshroom version. If you don't have an Nvidia GPU, you will need to use the Meshroom CL offshoot of it. Unfortunately, it's quite out of date compared to the Meshroom from Alice Vision. However, if you're like me and you only have an AMD GPU, then you have to use Meshroom CL. So there will be two sections of this tutorial, one where I'm going to go through the Nvidia side of it and one where I'm going to go over the C# side of it. So go ahead and download the version that you're looking for. In my case, it's going to be this version. So I'm going to click on tags. I'm going to grab 0.9. I am going to click on this guy and I'm going to save it. Now I already have it saved, so I'm just going to hit cancel, and I'll do the same thing for this version. We're going to hit this guy. We will download it, which I already have it downloaded, and I will hit cancel. So once you have it downloaded, then just jump to the section that you need, because depending on what your GPU is, depends on which version of Meshroom you want to use. Now, if you have an AMD GPU, you're going to need to use Meshroom CL. So go ahead and download that and extract it. And this is what you are going to have. So if we come into Meshroom CL, you will see that we have a bunch of things here. You can see we have a meshroom.exe, and that's the one that we're looking for. So we're going to double click that, and it's going to take a long time to load. So you'll see once it's loaded, it will look like this. And this is Meshroom. It's actually really simple. 99.9% of the time, you're not going to need to change anything in here. You basically just need to keep what you have and you should be good. Now, something that you should know is there is a drag and drop section here for your images. There is a node graph down here, which allows you to edit your mesh. So one of the cool things about Meshroom is that you can right click and add in different effects. Now, this is not fully a Meshroom tutorial. It's more of just how to do photogrammetry in general. So I'm not going to go into super depth here, but you can do stuff like do dense reconstruction of things. You can export your stuff out. You can do some processing. So for instance, if you have a mesh that's really highly detailed, you can actually decimate it down. So if you need a lower quality version of the mesh, that's a great option. Something I like to do a lot of times is decimate a mesh like this, and I like to drag my input mesh in like so. And then from there, I can actually output my mesh for my export. So a lot of times what I end up doing is I end up setting all this up with a decimate, and then I decimate it down to a fixed number of vertices, usually somewhere in the 5,000 range, so I can bring it into Blender to actually modify it myself. But that will be for a future portion of this tutorial, but I'll keep this one out here and we'll come back to it. So first things first, to get this to work, we need to grab our Darktable export. I'm going to hit Control A. I'm going to drag this over here and copy it in. And you'll see that it's going to import all of these guys in. Now, you can do some additional processing to this if you want to, but generally speaking, you don't need to. Now, you can either right click on these guys and click compute, and then you'll see that it's going to compute each section, or you can click this big green button here and it will just run through all of these from left to right, just like most node systems. Now, how each one of these works is this one loads your images. This one actually places where your cameras are located inside of the world. This one actually sets up your stereo 3D and actually generates out your mesh. And this one builds your actual mesh itself. So this one kind of creates your depth almost. This one filters your depth and creates mesh off of it. and this one creates textures for your object. Now, you always want to create your textures, and the reason why is because then you can project your detail onto your low poly later when you're done retopoing, and we'll go through that once we are done. Now, I just like to set it up kind of like this. I usually like to click on my structure from MotionCL, and I specify my OpenCL device, which ends up being my AMD GPU. You don't have to do that necessarily, but I like to do that because it makes sure that my GPU gets used. That being said, a lot of times it just doesn't use it. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So it just kind of depends. So once you have that set up in the specification, then you can just click start. And I usually just do continue without saving, although if you want to save, it will save your cache and your compute information. So that way you don't have to run through this again. But it's completely up to you. So I'll click continue without saving, and I'm going to let this run. Now this takes forever to run. This is one of the big struggles I have with Meshroom, is just how long this takes to run. So I'm going to have this run, and I'll be right back. All right, once we actually have all green all the way across, and green is all the way across up here, we are good to go. So now we can double click on mesh filtering, and it's going to take a second because everything's going to think for a second, and it's going to pull all that data back. For whatever reason, it doesn't automatically show you what you're looking at. You actually kind of have to double click on it, and you can see this is the mesh reconstruction. Now, it definitely missed some of the stuff that we were trying to do, but that's okay. We might need to rerun it again. We'll see. If we do our multi-view stereo CL, let's take a look at that and see if that gets us a better result. We might have to play around with it a tiny bit. So you can see if we shut off these guys, we definitely are missing some of our data. If we go to texturing CL, this will show you guys what it does. So basically texturing CL gives us a textured version of the actual mesh itself. And you can see it has a nice texture to it. Now we are missing a large sum of our actual mesh itself. According to our pictures, we should have an entire thing on this side, and it doesn't look like it even noticed that that side was completed, which means we have a problem on our hands. We can also take a look at our decimated version of it, which is actually pretty decently decimated. So that's basically what that node does. So you can actually see based off of this what they all do. So you have structure from MotionCL, which basically creates this point cloud data. Then you have your mesh filtering, or the multi-view stereo, I should say. So you can see this multi-view stereo. And you can see the mesh filtering where it actually meshes that data in. And then texturing CL, which will create your textures and project it on. You also could output this mesh and do texturing CL again, and it actually would texture this decimated version as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, I'm not sure why it didn't quite work. My guess is that we're going to need to increase our number of compute source images for it to get it done correctly. And I might need to uncheck my specify OpenCL device just so that I can recalculate everything. So I'll probably just need to uncheck specify OpenCL device, which is going to reset everything. And I'm going to have to run through all of this, unfortunately, again. And the unfortunate part is that this usually takes like 2 hours for me to run through it all because I'm doing OpenCL. So I'm going to run this through again, just through my CPU to see if that gives me a better result. And if it does, great. And if it doesn't, well, then we'll go from there. So I will be right back. All right, let's take a look at it. So you can see we have a much bigger object. So there must be something that got funky somewhere and it just kind of broke. So if we take a look at our texturing CL and we hide our mesh itself, you can see this is what it looks like. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wow, that looks horrible, right? It looks terrible. Look at that texture setup here. You can see how bright everything is. It just looks awful. I promise that it's actually not that bad. The big issue that we run into with doing it through Meshroom is that instead of doing something as a shadeless texture, it actually projects light on the texture as you look at it. So it's actually mixing a lot of light with your texture. So it will look a lot worse than it actually is. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, if we look at our mesh decimate, you can see this is what our mesh decimate looks like, which actually is pretty good. We want to do a mesh decimate because that's going to get our polygon count from something like 2 million down to something around 9,000. So that's kind of the big deal here. Now, for us to export our stuff, we just need to right click, come down into export, and go into publish. And then all we have to do is just drag our output mesh like this, and we can output our mesh, our material, and our textures like that. And the nice thing about this is that when you do this, you can have your decimate version and your actual texture version as well. And then you can publish it. Now it's going to tell you where do you want to put it. And in my case, I have a spot for it in my temp folder, which is right here. So I'm just going to copy this path. I'm going to put it into my output folder. And then I'm going to right click publish and compute. And what it's going to do is it's going to actually output that information right here into my temp folder. Now, something that you'll notice immediately is look at how many of these files it put out. And this is something that's really frustrating about Meshroom, is that it'll dump it all out as a bunch of files. And you're going to need to basically mix all of that into your low poly mesh. So if you see this low poly here, this will need to be mixed down and baked all of this information, if that makes sense. So once you get to this point, you can go ahead and skip the next section. I'm basically going to go through all of this again, but with an Nvidia GPU. So basically just skip this next section, and then we're going to talk about how to retopo this and actually make it work for your game. Now, for the Nvidia GPU, I don't actually have one. So I have one of my friends driving, and I'm just going to kind of explain what he's doing, because unfortunately I don't have an Nvidia GPU, so I can't really run this on my machine. So forgive me if some of the stuff is a little bit off or a little weird. I have him driving, and I'm just kind of voicing over. And once you have Meshroom installed on your Nvidia system, we're going to import our images. So I'm going to drag a file over here, and here is all of my files. So I'm going to select all of these guys. I'm going to drag it over into my add images, and we're going to talk about Meshroom a little bit. So over here on the left is where your image gallery actually is. In the center is your image viewer. This is where you can see all of your images and actually check them out. And over here on the right is where all of your viewport actually is. So you can actually see your mesh in there. Now down here on the bottom is where all of your nodes are located. Meshroom is a node-based system, so you can actually see that it flows from left to right. Now, the first one here is the camera init, and basically camera init initializes your cameras and get them ready. And then you have feature extraction, and feature extraction basically allows you to extract the features from your images to make them so that you can actually match them. And that leads us into image matching, which basically matches your images and sets them up so that you can have different matches of your image, right? So it can determine 3D space. Then you have feature matching, which is basically like image matching, but a little bit more detailed and a little bit easier to work with. It's a little bit more detailed and it aligns your images in a better way. Then you have structure from motion, which basically builds out a small loose mesh of what your object's going to look like. And then you have prepare dense scene. And prepare dense scene basically just takes your object and basically produces a dense point cloud of information. And that basically allows the depth map to understand the 3D depth of your image better. And then we have depth map. And depth map basically creates a bunch of black and white images that basically determine the depth of your image. And that allows it to create a more dense mesh that's more accurate to what our object actually is. And then we have a filter, which basically filters out some of the dirtiness of our depth map and kind of cleans up our mesh a little bit. And then finally, we have meshing. And meshing basically meshes and creates our high poly. And then that leads into mesh filtering, which basically will smooth out our mesh and make it a little bit cleaner. And then finally, the most important one, which is the texturing. And that basically allows us to texture our mesh and make it look like the real world object. Now, the cool thing about nodes is that we can actually add nodes. So if we right click, we can see we have a bunch of options. If we head down to mesh post-processing, we can actually add in a decimate. And that's one of the cool things about Meshroom is that we can actually change how our project works just by dragging and dropping different nodes and different things like that. Now you'll see here, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to change my max vertices from 0 to about 5,000. And that's going to give us a good solid low poly to start from when we bring this into Blender. And then to hook this up, we need to grab our mesh filtering mesh right here and drag it into our input map. Now, once we have this, we could basically just go back to the front and then start running our workflow. So you'll see right here, you'll see our camera in it is green. So I actually can't compute it. I already did this earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on feature extraction and click compute. So what that means is that you guys can run each individual node all the way down the line. So I'm going to run this real quick and I'm going to be right back. Now, once that's completed, we can go into image matching and we can right click it and click compute, but we also can just go up to the top here and click start. So I'm going to do that. Now, this is going to take a long time because it's going to have to run through all of these different nodes and it's going to take a long time for it to happen. So I'm going to be right back. Okay, so you can see that we are done. So in our upper right-hand corner here in our 3D viewer, we actually have a dense mesh of what our stuff looks like. If we double click on mesh filtering, we can actually see what our mesh is going to look like. Now, this is going to take a second to load, and you'll see that we have our dense mesh. Now, we do have our structure from motion here. So I'm going to hide that, and you can see here is our dense mesh, and it came out pretty decent. This looks pretty good. And you can see how detailed this mesh actually came out. It came out really well. So I'm going to hide that real quick. I'm going to double click on my texturing and you'll see it's going to load our textures. And there we go. So now you can see what it looks like when it's textured. And it extracted a lot of the detail, which is good. That's exactly what we wanted. So you can see how nice that looks. And then if we double click on mesh decimate, you'll see this is what it looks like decimated. And it looks pretty decent as well. So it's going to give us a nice starting point when we clean this up inside of Blender and we actually make it into a nice low poly object. Now, how do we export out our mesh? Well, what we can do is we can right click here in the viewport, the node graph, and go to export publish. And then we have to come in here and we have to drag our mesh into our input file and our mesh out of our texturing and our material out of our texturing and our textures out. And then we need to actually give it a place to put it. So if we click on publish, we go out to our C, right click, and add in a new folder. We'll add in a folder called temp. And we'll just double click on that guy and we'll copy this path right up here at the top. And then we'll click on publish and paste it into our output folder. And there we go. Now we just right click compute and click. And there we go. And that's going to export it out for us. So you can see right here, here is all of our files exported for us, which is awesome. So now you basically have your mesh created and exported and ready to go to be processed inside of Blender. So now you can just move on to the next section and you should be good to go. So I will see you guys there. Once we have our low poly version and our high poly version exported out, either from the AMD GPU or from the Nvidia GPU, from here, we can basically start building out our stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Blender real quick. And I'm going to hit AX and I am going to delete everything out of my scene here. I'm going to go to File, Import, OBJ, and I'm going to go into Temp, and I'm going to grab my textured mesh and my mesh, and I'm going to hit Import OBJ. And what that's going to do is that's going to import both of my OBJ files. Now, something to keep in mind is one is a low poly with no texture and one is a high poly with a texture. So if we take a look at this, you can see that they're both over top of each other. Textured mesh is my high poly and mesh is my kind of pseudo low poly. What I mean by pseudo low poly is it not necessarily a low poly, it's just a lower poly than what we had. So if we take a look at our textured mesh, if we hit Z material preview, you can see that it already loaded our material. It's going to take a second because it has bunch of information to load, and my encoder is probably getting overloaded right now because there's so much information being loaded into my GPU. So hopefully you guys can hear me. But you can see right here is the actual result right here. So you can see it actually turned out fairly well. Now, I would probably like to adjust this to kind of make this a little bit darker, but I think for the most part, it turned out pretty well. Now I'm going to hit Z and I'm going to go to solid because the amount of information that it's pulling in is gigabytes worth of VRAM, and it's just crushing my computer. So I'm going to hide this guy. I'm going to show my low poly. I'm going to click on it, hit tab, and you can see what it looks like. And we'll first just paint out what we don't want. So we really don't want all this extra garbage around our mesh. We basically just want where this line kind of comes in. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to hit C, and I'm just going to paint in right here to get rid of all of this extra stuff here. And then we'll kind of get into our actual retopoing of this object. We'll hit C and paint this in like so. And there we, too much. So we'll unpaint that, repaint this. There we go. We'll hit X, delete vertexes. We'll hit L, Control I, X, vertexes. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Z, wireframe. We're going to hit C on the center portion of this, like so. And I'll pull back all of these guys like this. I'm going to hit Control G to assign it to a new group. And then I'm going to add in a decimation modifier. Okay. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to decimate my mesh down and auto retopologize it. This is going to save us a lot of trouble, but I don't really want to destroy the center here. So I can pull this down, change my vertex group to group, and then flip it. And then it only affects the tertiary details around that object. So I can come in and kind of decimate this down to something like maybe 2,500 polygons. And then take a look at this. So if we look at our wireframe, that's within reason, I think. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this so that I have a history. I'm going to hide that bad boy. I'm going to click on my mesh. I'm going to apply it. And then I'm going to come in here and start cleaning this up a little bit. So first things first, I'm not worried about destroying a lot of these vertexes. So for instance, if I look at this on the side, you can see how all this is flat. So the majority of this can just be removed. So quick tip on how to do that efficiently is you can literally just grab these guys like so, X, delete faces, and I'll grab these guys as well because they don't really need to be there. Select this, F, Control T to triangulate it. And there you go. You've got yourself a nice, simple mesh. Now, there is a slight issue with this, so I'm going to kind of smooth it out so it's just a little bit smoother than what we originally had it as. And there we go. Easy enough. And now we could basically do the same thing for these guys. If you want to do it that way, that's one way. Or if you click up here, you can actually just slide these guys into place. So you can hit GG and slide them. So those are two ways that I like to retopo stuff. And that's basically how I approach it. Now, I'm going to run through and retopo this, and I'll throw on some music in the background so you guys can listen to it while I run through and do this. You guys can just kind of watch me do this, or you can follow along, of course. So I'm going to be right back, and I will speed retopo this. All right, I think we're good to go. So we're at 600 triangles, and I think that's pretty good. Now, we could go lower or we could go higher if we wanted a different LOD, but I think that this is pretty reasonable for what we're trying to go for. So now what we have to do is we have to bake our meshes and unwrap this guy. So unwrapping this guy should be relatively easy. We can do this one of two ways. We can go into UV editing, and we can hit A, U, and Smart UV Project and project it, which gave us actually a pretty decent result. And I didn't really expect that, but I think that might work. So I'm going to hit N and go to UV Packer, which I'll leave to a link to in the description below. And I'll click on that. It'll help pack it a little bit better. But I think, what if I change it to something like 90? Well, that gave us something pretty decent. So I think that's going to work. So I think we'll stick with it. So I'm going to let that Smart UV project stand instead of manually unwrapping this whole thing. And a lot of times I do that because it saves a lot of time, and since the asset's not going to move, it's not going to change very much. So Smart UV project saves a lot of time. Now I'm just going to bake my mesh. So I'm going to grab my texture mesh, and you can see it has all that detail and all that nice resolution that we're looking for. I'm going to hit N, go into my bake lab. I'm going to change my individual objects to selected to active. Now, if you don't know anything about BakeLab, it's an add-on that basically allows you to automate your bake process. And I'll leave a link to that in the description below, providing that I remember to do all of these different things. But it's going to help make everything a lot easier. And I know a lot of people have preferences of what they're looking for. So whatever bake add-on you want to use is totally fine. It shouldn't really matter that much, but it's up to you. Now I'm going to select my texture mesh, and I'm going to select my mesh, and then I'm going to change my bake mode from individual to selected to active. I'm going to click the plus icon. I'm going to add in my albedo map. I'm going to make this 4096 by 4096. Then I'm going to hit the plus icon and add in my normal map, and then I'm going to also add in my AO map. Now, you could bake your roughness and your metallic map, but that's going to make things a little complicated. We'd have to go in and basically tag stuff to be metallic, but I'm just going to go in and actually paint it and build it manually. That's going to save us a lot of trouble, and it's going to be a little bit easier on our system resources. So I'll show you guys how to do that in a little bit. Now I'm going to click bake, and I will be right back. Okay, now if we click generate mesh, generate materials, and we hide our mesh and we look at our material preview, you can see that our result is not super great. So it looks like our AO map has a lot of problems. If we take a look at it, you can see our AO map is really terrible. If we take a look at our normal map, it looks pretty decent. And if we look at our albedo map, that looks really good. So I think it's just my AO map. And the way we can double check that is by going into our shading real quick. We can drag our principle to surface, and you can see that that looks about right. So we know that it is our AO map. So let's fix that problem. Let's go back to our layout. Let's unhide our textured mesh, select it, select our low detailed mesh, and then hit N, go into BakeLab, hit finish. We're going to uncheck our albedo and normal, and we're going to have to do some adjustments here. You can see we have selected to active. If we click on the little settings gear, we can up our bake margin and up our cage extrusion, maybe something like 0.71. It depends on what you need, but I'm going to reduce my bake margin back down to probably 8, I think. And then we're going to click bake, and we'll see how that goes. And I'm going to be right back. We'll be right back. And now that should work. If I zoom out, you can take a look at it. It seems to have solved our issue. So I'm going to click generate materials, finish. I'm going to hide my textured map, and I'm going to go into material preview. And you can see what it looks like, although it definitely missed some of our textures. So we'll go into shading, and we're going to clean that up a little bit. So I will duplicate my AO 2 times, and I'm going to change that to my normal map. I'm going to add in a normal map, and I will drag that in. And then we're going to do the same thing here, but for our albedo map. I'm going to drag that guy into our base color, and there we go. And that doesn't look too bad. But we do need to build our roughness map and our metallic map. So let's go do that. Now, to create our metallic and roughness maps, all we have to do is basically create a map and just kind of paint in what we want. So what I'll do is I'll come into texture paint like so, and I'm going to throw this into rendered mode. So that way we have some kind of rendered mode. I'm going to change my texture. You can see we have the AOTN right here. I'm going to hit plus, and I'm going to drop in a metallic map. And you can see that it has mesh baked 001 metallic. You can basically call it whatever you would like. I'm just going to go with mesh metallic, and we're going to make that 4096. So 4096, and we'll hit enter on that. And our default color is going to be black because metallic needs it to be black to be non-metallic. And then if we take a look, you can see here, all of this should be metallic. So I'm going to paint it with white, and that should hopefully update it, providing that we have our metallic map set, which is right here. I have my radius set. I have it set to white. I am selecting my metallic map, and that should, in theory, work. Let me see. So if I paint this white, does that actually affect it? So let me go like this. There we go. And then we can kind of come in. Let me see if this is actually making any difference. If I paint, I'm not seeing anything. Yeah, it's not really affecting it. So let's see if there's something that I'm doing wrong here. So that worked, but text raw is not working. I think it's having a problem with me not setting the proper mask, maybe? No, that still didn't work. Well, I'm not quite sure why that didn't work, but that's one way to do it, so you can have a nice metallic map. But if you want a slightly more detailed map, what I like to do is I like to save all my stuff out. So if I go to my mesh texture here, I'm going to go into my image. I'm going to save it as, and I'm going to drop it out into my temp folder, which was where all this stuff is. And I'm going to say mesh t.png. I'm going to save that. I'm going to open up my temp, and I have my mesh t.png, and I'm going to open up a program called Krita right here. And I'm going to basically just file, open. You can see me doing a tutorial template there. I'm going to come into my C temp, and I'm going to go into my mesh T right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to build my actual metallic map and technically my roughness map. So I'll come in here and I'll go in and I will say adjust levels. And all I'm doing is looking at this area, areas that I know are metallic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to crush it. So that way I can really get just the areas that I know are going to be metallic. I'm going to pull this in like this. And it's really going to push up that metallic color. But I'll show you why I'm going to do this in a second. So I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to hit plus. I'm going to do a desaturate actually beforehand. So we'll go to background, adjust, desaturate. I'm going to get rid of all the color onto this paint layer. And I'm going to paint this with black. So that way I know that it's not going to be metallic. I'm going to paint all of this black. And this works, by the way, for your 4 other assets as well. So you don't have to worry about necessarily changing up this method. I know that this isn't technically physically accurate, but believe me when I say that most of the time when you see assets, they're not physically accurate anyway. So this is a decent way to go about it. Unfortunately, there's not really an easy way to extract the metallicness of an object. I know some people have really expensive tools that can do it, but unfortunately, I can't afford the really expensive tools to do it. So I'm just going to go this route and make it as close as I possibly can. I'm going to pull this guy nice and tight like this. I'm going to hit my eraser. I'm going to bring this back a tiny bit. And I know for a fact that these guys cannot be metallic. So I'm going to get rid of my eraser. I'm going to come in here and clean this area up and make it dark. So that way it's not metallic. I'll help smooth that in. I'm going to grab my eraser and I'm going to erase this back out. And actually, I think that this needs to be black. So actually, let's make this black instead. And the nice thing about metallic maps is that they don't have to be perfect. So you don't have to make sure that it's absolutely perfect. You just have to make it look somewhat good, and you should be okay. And this will give us a very, very, very good map that's high detailed that actually follows the object a bit better, if that makes sense. Now, the other method that you can do, if you don't want to do it this way, is if you were to grab, if I grab my temp, redrag this guy in, and I insert it as a new layer, see if Magic Wand gives us a better selection criteria. I got too much there, so let's try bringing our threshold down a tiny bit, deselecting, making it a bit pickier. There we go. I think that's going to be our winner right here. So this is the other method, is by using basically the Magic Wand tool to just kind of come in, select our stuff, and then say select, invert selection, hit the plus button, and then grab our fill bucket. We'll click fill, and that's going to fill this with black. And then we can just take this guy here and just desaturate it. So we can come in here, go to file, select, deselect, filter, adjust, desaturate. That's going to desaturate it to gray. And then we're going to come in and just do what we did before, which was our levels adjustment, and just come in and crush the blacks, crush the whites to make it very close to being extremely white. Because sometimes when you have patina, it kind of gets rid of that color, if that makes sense. So that will give us a pretty good little metallic map. We could save this guy, so export it out, and then we'll go into C, temp, and then we'll just come in here and say mesh metallic.png, and we'll save that guy. And then we're going to do the same thing, but for our roughness map. So you can see, so for our roughness map, we can basically just take what we have here with our desaturation, and we can just kind of drag in a levels adjustment. We could basically pull this up and really get ourselves some good values here. So roughness goes from bright means really rough and dark means not very rough. So I'm going to pull these guys down to make it extremely rough, like so. And then I'm going to take this area here and basically back it down. So I'm going to grab this guy. I pull my threshold down quite drastically. I'm sure there are people out there that know this tool better than me going, you could have just done, it differently, but this is generally how I approach it, and it's probably not the best way, but it's how I know how to do it. Filter, adjust, levels adjustment, and I'll bring this down. Let me see if we pull this up and then select, deselect, and then file, export, and we will export this out as a roughness map. Now all we have to do is bring it back into Blender. So if we open up Blender and we come into shading, we can basically drag these two guys in. So I'm going to grab my two temp files and drag in my roughness and drag in my metallic maps. And then we can drag them into, and we can drag them in here like this and like, whoops, this. And that should make it look horrible. That's way too shiny for our material. Let's take a look at our stone, if our stone looks okay. I think our stone is also probably too shiny. Let's head back here. Let's readjust this. So is it from that, or is it from my normal map? I think the normal map might be a little bit too intense, but actually let's change this to non-colored data, which is what Godot is going to interpret it as. And same thing with our metallic map. If I go over to our metallic map and I interpret it as non-colored data, that gives me a little bit better results. That's more of what we were expecting. There we go. Now this part here is very not great, and this is a little bit too shiny for my liking, but that's basically how I approach it. Now I'm going to mess around with it, and then I will be right back with basically what it's going to look like. And there we go. So you can see that this is basically our final asset. So if I come in here and I click on different scene lighting, you can see how it reacts to those different lighting conditions. I can actually rotate my light. If I click up here, I can rotate it. You guys can see how it gets affected by the light, which I think it looks pretty okay, all things considered. Now, something that we could do if we wanted to clean up a little bit is we could come in here and clean up these edges a tiny bit. So that way it doesn't have that additional bit of, sand and dirt and things like that. We could actually come in and clean this up just a tiny bit. Now, the last thing that we have to do is we have to center this object. And the easiest way to do it is in layout. So you go to layout, change this to solid, and you will see that our origin is way over here. So what I like to do is I go to object, set origin, geometry to origin. I hit tab A. I go to right view, and I'm going to close that. And I'll rotate this like this. I'm going to rotate it on the Z axis so that it matches up just well. And I'm going to rotate this on the Y axis. So that way everything just kind of fits. The goal is basically to make it so that everything just kind of fits in as a decently well put together mesh. You can see what it looks like, which I think it looks pretty good. Sometimes I like to come in and just select all of these edges like so. Now go into edge select mode. And I like to just E and just drag that down just a tiny bit, scale it along the Z axis and bring that down just a tiny bit. That way it has something to work with in case the user, for whatever reason, needs to, bump it up just a tiny bit. We have a little lip there. But from here, all we have to do is export our stuff out. So I'm going to click on this guy, File, Export. And depending on the game engine that you use, you can use whatever format you want to use. In my case, I'm going to use GLTF because that's the format that I prefer. So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to go out to my temp folder, and I'm going to call this Cracked Sewer Drain. And I'm just going to include my selected object, and I'm going to export it out as GLTF. Hey, Editor Mitch here. So something to note when you're doing your export, when you export out your GLTF file, it's not going to export out your occlusion map. So I call that out, I believe, later, that it doesn't really pull out your occlusion map. But in further testing, I did find out a way to actually achieve that. So if you click on your occlusion map here, Shift duplicate it, Control group, and then delete this out of the group. If we go into our group input and name it as GLTF settings, then we can come in here, click on our group, click on our vector, change this to color, and name it occlusion. And as long as you do that, you can hit tab to ungroup this. And it looks like we'll have to rename this GLTF space settings, and then we can drag this in here, and this will allow it to be exported with your occlusion map. So I just want to let you guys know. So let's continue with the tutorial. It's going to take all this stuff, it's going to mix it down and then export it out. So now if we just open up our game engine of choice, which in my case is going to be Godot, just because I generally do Godot tutorials, we're going to hit new project. And I'm just going to name this as test render scene for photo assets, which I'm going to have to keep around for when I do these assets more often. We're going to drag this guy in, and we'll grab all of these guys. We'll drag it into Godot real quick. It's going to let it import it. If we're lucky, the GLB will just import it and import all the textures with it, but sometimes it doesn't. So I like to import them separately just to make sure. That being said, if it does it correctly this time, then maybe I have cracked the code to what causes it. But we'll right click new inherited scene, and you can see here is our object inside of the Godot world. Now you'll notice that it doesn't quite look the same. My guess is if I go into my surface, our albedo's here, our metallic is here as well. Our normal map is here. Our roughness map is here. Our AO map is not. So that one did not get put in, but that's okay. So what we can do is we can double click on our GLB. You can see it'll import it like this. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in here, grab this guy, actions, extract my material, and I'll just select my current folder. That's fine. And click re-import. And it's going to go ahead and re-import that. Now you'll see that we have our TRES file. So if I double click on that, you'll see that we actually have our roughness, our albedo, our metallic, our normal map, and we will have our AO map right here. So we'll click on enable and we will drag our AO map into this. So it looks like we could probably get away without doing a albedo, metallic, and normal map. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's really useful. And we'll select our mesh like this, and we'll change our material of our mesh to this new material here, providing that it lets me. So let me clear this material. We drag this material on, and there you go. Now, something else that you might notice is there's some culling mode stuff in here, and there's also a slight change in the vertex color. So if we get rid of that, that should solve that little weird, there's a little weird lighting issue that you might run into. So sometimes I have to do that to solve it. But if we right click, add in a reflection probe, you can see what our environment looks like. And you can see that it actually has reflection to it. So if I right click, add in a CSG mesh, and I click on this guy, I click on here, I add in a box mesh, you can see that with our reflection probe, we can have slight bits of reflection from this. So that's kind of what we're trying to achieve. But I think that that actually looks really decent, especially if you're playing a first-person shooter and you're looking down at like this angle here. This looks really nice. Now, this is a 4K texture, and that might be a little bit too high resolution for what you're trying to do, and that's okay. You know, change the resolution as you guys need. And that is basically my approach to creating a photo scanned asset from pictures all the way to a 3D object I can use in my game. So if you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. Hey, you know, if you dislike this video, go ahead and hit that dislike button because I am here to make content for you guys. You know, this video was a viewer suggested video. So if you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll be more than happy to take a look at them. You know, I'm looking at some networking tutorials. I'm still doing the horror series. This actually is going to be an asset for the horror series. So that's kind of the lens I'm looking at a lot of my tutorials, is just what fits in and what doesn't. So please let me know. I'm always willing to look at something new. And hey, if you have any questions or comments, or you just want to tell me that I'm dumb, hit me up in the comments below, or hit me up on Discord, links in the description. I'll be more than happy to help you out, or, you know, respond to you anyway. But that is all I have for you guys today. So thank you so much again for watching. I will see you all next time. Thanks.